If you regularly swim, bike and run, the chances are you're going to experience some sort of niggles at some point in various areas of your body. And if you ignore these, they could turn into more serious injuries. So we're here to help you notice and identify the early signs so you can prevent the most common triathlon injuries. I've gone for the broad title of swimmer's shoulder, as that does cover any injury related to the shoulder that comes on from swimming. And it's not really a surprise that there's quite a few of these, because swimming in its nature is a very repetitive movement and the shoulder a very mobile joint. So therefore it is quite susceptible to having injuries. And if you think about it, it's a ball and socket joint, which gives it that huge range of motion. But then it means it relies on ligaments, muscles and tendons in order to control it. And if one of those aspects is not quite working properly, it can start to lead to impingement, which can then lead to inflammation. And once you've got inflammation there, any other action is going to aggravate it and it becomes a bit of a vicious circle. And the most common shoulder pain that comes on from swimming is usually to do with an inflamed tendon or a bursa. A bursa is a fluid-filled sac that basically helps the joint and all the areas around the shoulder move smoothly. And this tends to happen as a result of three things. Either you've increased your volume too quickly, you don't have correct muscle firing patterns, so some muscles are working more than others, or you've got really poor technique. And quite often, actually, it's a small amount of each of those that contribute to this. So in order to prevent swimmer's shoulder, you need to address each of those. And the first thing is have a look back at your swimming diary and check that you've not increased that volume too quickly before your shoulders have got the conditioning. Make sure you've got the correct movement, so have some technique analysis, and also check your movement firing patterns, and by doing some strength and conditioning work in the gym will help with that. And naturally, posture tends to not really help our shoulder position when swimming, because we're often sat in the position I'm sat right now. So your shoulders are slightly protracted, they're rotated inwards, and all the muscles at the front are shortened and the muscles at the back are lengthened and weakened. When you come to swim, they're not going to be working correctly. So a nice warm-up exercise could be to lie down on your front with your arms in a goalpost position. And from here, you're simply trying to pull your hands off the ground ever so slightly. So you're activating all the muscles down the back. And just make sure before any swim session, you do a really thorough, nice dry land warm-up as well. And even though the shoulder is a mobile joint naturally, you still need to work on that mobility, so make sure you do plenty of exercises that will keep the mobility in your shoulders, that will also help with your technique, so it goes hand in hand. But if you want more tips or ways to prevent swimmer's shoulder, we've actually got a video specifically on that, so I'd check that out. Let's move down the body to the back, and I am keeping it broad again here because we don't have enough time to cover the neck, the thoracic spine and the lower back all in one video. But one thing in common for all back and neck injuries, they tend to be exacerbated or most notable when cycling, and that's often a result of poor posture or incorrect muscle firing and just not being able to hold that position. So whether it's a stiff neck that's giving you problems, or lack of movement in your thoracic spine, or maybe a weak lumbar spine and you're finding you're overextending in that area, all of these areas can actually be addressed by following some basic rules when it comes to your training. And it's also worth noting that if you're tight in one part of the back, it might then mean that you're not conditioned enough, or you don't have the strength in another area. So it's worth noting that where you maybe experience discomfort or pain might not be the source of the problem when it comes to the back. So I would recommend starting by looking at your position on the bike. Are you stretching to reach your handlebars? Is your saddle too low, so you're flexing your lower back too much? Are you sitting symmetrically? How do you hold your head when you're riding on the bike? Also, when you're easy, but when you're riding hard. If you're already experiencing problems, then a bike fit would be a really great and probably quite obvious place to start. And once you're happy with your position on the bike, make sure you include mobility work, potentially some before your ride if you really need that, but definitely make sure you do plenty of movement when you finish your bike ride. I know you might be tired, but your body will thank you. So doing some flexion and extension work, so lying on your front, gradually lifting up your shoulders and your head and stretching out the front, but then also doing some forward folds and twists are a really nice action to do after cycling. So lying on your back and dropping your knees down to either side and potentially moving your arms and your head in the opposite direction will just really give your spine that nice gentle twist, but don't do anything too extreme. And then finally, the strength element. There's kind of a pattern forming here, but if you are expecting your body to hold a certain position on the bike, then you might need to do some additional training for that. So make sure you look at focusing, strengthening those back muscles, but also your core, because they work together. The front and the back of your body do need to make sure they're coordinated together. And also make sure that you build up your cycling gradually, because if you're doing that and you don't have any initial problems, then you should find that your body will naturally get strong enough just as it gets used to cycling those miles. Knee pain is seriously general, but for triathletes, the most common form is anterior knee pain, aka runner's knee. Now, this is surprisingly brought on from running, but also cycling, and usually it's a combination of both, and it's a relationship of basically the muscles not firing properly and some muscles being too long and some being too short and tight. So yeah, you probably guessed it, there's a bit of a pattern forming here. However, something that people often don't expect is that knee pain is quite often coming as a result of something that's going wrong further up the chain. So it's a good idea to look at the hip area, and sometimes even something might be happening at the ankle and foot. I'm not saying always, I'm just saying it is more likely than not that that's where the problem is coming from. If you think about it, when you're on the bike, you're in a very flexed position at the hip, which is going to cause everything to become tight at the front of your body and can cause your glutes and your hamstrings to switch off slightly. When you're running, if your glutes are weak, then you might be dropping at the hip on the weight-bearing side, which causes more pressure on your knee to try and stop it from falling in. Also, quite simply, having tight quadriceps and hip flexors can put more pressure on that patella tendon, so as the kneecap is running over the front of your knee, and that just causes it to inflame that bursa, that fluid-filled sac underneath, or it can make it just track incorrectly. So basically, what I'm saying is tight and weak muscles at the hip can lead to anterior knee pain, and you're probably guessing the answer here. It's going to be some hard work, yes, some activation and some mobility and strength work combined. So before you head out for your run, it's a really good idea to actually try and get your glutes firing so that everything's already kind of awake and working and more likely to work more efficiently. So doing some simple things like crab walks or hip bridges, something similar that's just going to get everything kind of woken up, and then a bit of a dynamic warm up as well with some walking lunges will help to stretch out and open the front of your hips, and you can then do a more deep stretch at the end of your run when your body's warm. Muscle strains are less straightforward when it comes to predicting an injury, but there are certain signs that you can look for. When it comes to triathlon, or more specifically running, it tends to be the calves and the hamstrings that are most susceptible to picking up some sort of strain in the sense of an injury. Now, the reason they're hard to predict is something that comes on rather suddenly, but there's usually an underlying reason for that. It could be a sudden increase in training volume, expecting a muscle to work under a high load when it's not fully warmed up, or maybe pushing that muscle when it's already quite fatigued. So you guessed it, you can actually address that by addressing each of those aspects. And therefore, the best way to manage or reduce the chance of strains is to manage your training load sensibly. Have a plan, stick to it. Ensure you have those rest days, because that's when your body recovers, it repairs, and it basically reduces the chance of any injury. If you've got a key session, make sure you do a really thorough warm-up, because your body and your muscles need to be ready to take that extreme force. And if there's any underlying weakness, it will get found out if you haven't done that warm-up. And overall, as the kind of running theme goes through this, is to make sure you keep up with your conditioning work, your mobility work, so there's no areas that are weaker than others or are maybe tighter, because they're going to be susceptible to having a fault or something going wrong. And the whole kind of ethos is basically don't change anything too dramatically, and the same goes for any footwear. So if you're suddenly changing your run shoes, try to adapt slowly and do your easy runs in a new pair first, and also don't suddenly change the type of terrain that you're going to be running on. A stress fracture can often come about from a similar way to a muscle strain, but it's more likely to be related to that sudden increase in training load when your body is not adapted. But because it's affecting the bone, it tends to take longer and it happens more gradually. And as a result, you might well be aware of the discomfort earlier on, so hopefully you can identify it and stop it progressing. But it's not uncommon in triathlon, and especially for athletes who've come from a swimming background or a cycling background, because they're not used to the weight-bearing stress that you get from running. Because yes, most stress fractures for triathletes are usually a result of running, and the majority of them tend to happen in the tibia, the shin bone. You will get stress fractures in some of the bones in the feet and potentially even the hip. Well, if you do increase your training gradually, you've got good running technique and the correct footwear that are in still good condition, you're halfway there to preventing stress fractures. You also want to make sure you keep a good eye on your nutrition and making sure you're getting enough vitamin D, as that's all part of helping you to keep healthy bones and helping with the repair process. Now, I said it does come on gradually, so as a result, you can look for the niggles or the early warning signs, and it tends to be tenderness in those common site areas that I mentioned, like your shins. So it can be a development on from shin splints. Sometimes it's something you'll notice when you're doing the actual activity, so when you're running and you're weight bearing. Other times you might notice it on palpation, but it's a really good idea to keep an eye on anything that seems like that, because prevention when it comes to stress fractures is far better than cure. We have kept it broad, but it's just to give you an idea of the potential areas that could be susceptible to getting niggles as you up your triathlon training, and having that awareness of your body is a really great starting point. But if you want more detail on any of those specific areas, we've actually got standalone videos for runner's knee, swimmer's shoulder, Achilles tendonitis, and for shin splints. So go and check those out for a more detailed approach. But hopefully you guys haven't experienced any of these injuries at a serious level just yet. But any niggles that you might have or you think are common in triathlon we haven't covered, do share those in the comments section below. Hopefully you've enjoyed it, and I really hope it can stop you getting any serious injuries. So give us a like if so, and remember you can hit that globe and subscribe as well.